Issue 102, Lecture on the 1960s, Part 3. So the next part of this is I do have a handout I want to go over. It's in your Canvas shell in the 1960s page where you can review this with me. The handout I want to go over is I want to talk about politics in the 1960s. Let me make this bigger for you. One of the reasons why I'm going over this part is in the last lecture on the 50s, we started talking about what? We started talking about modern American conservatism. And we contrasted it with, earlier in the semester, we talked about progressivism as a political ideology. And then in your last lecture on the 50s, we talked about American conservatism. And the rest of the semester, we followed through with these two kind of ideological points of view. And they affect us even today in American politics. Even so, it's even a current events issue. American progressivism and modern American conservatism. And it's two differing visions of American society. And when we talked about the 1950s, I demonstrated that, right? How you view the 50s says a lot about where you're at politically. People that are more politically progressive view the 1950s as the last evil decade. In the 1960s as a great decade of social change and reform, right? More conservative ideological people view the 50s as the last good moral decade, and the 60s as chaotic, the unraveling of America. America comes apart. And so you get it. And so you have this progressive thread, American progressivism and American conservatism. And you have this thread of, two separate visions of America. And you see that with how the 50s and the 60s are viewed, right? To progressivism, the 50s are the last bad decade and 60s are great. About time, social change and we're going. And to more conservative-minded individuals, the 50s are kind of last decade when America was united as a society, where Americans were Americans and loved their country and trusted their government and were religious. 1955, the New York City skyscrapers would put crosses, would have lights for crosses on their buildings, right? Kind of the last religious decade kind of a thing, right? In the 60s, the destruction of that American order kind of a thing. Yeah. And so the 1960s, politically represents kind of that vision of America. There's two different visions of America. It's a hinge point also for American progressivism and American conservatism. That again still affects us today, right? The first part we're going to talk about is the crisis of American conservatism. Okay. Let's look at this. So the Republican Party between 1900 and 1928 won 6 of 8 presidential elections, okay? The Republican Party in the early part of the 20th century was the party, winning 6 of 8 elections. The only two they lost, 1912 to Wilson and 1916 to Wilson, right? Won the decade. Won 3 decades. First, 3, the 1900s, teens, and the 20s, right? Republicans controlled both houses of Congress for most of that period, from 1900 to 1928. Okay. Well, what do you have? What do you have happen? You have disaster. Well, switch it. From 1932 to 48, the Republican Party loses 5 straight elections. Yikes. That is a losing streak, right? Okay. You lose 5 straight elections. You lose the 32 election, the 36 election, the 40 election, the 44 election in 1948. Right? You lose to Roosevelt 4 times and Truman once. Okay. The only congressional win in 1946, you win the House for 2 years. In 1948, Democrats win the House back. So, for the Senate, the U.S. Senate is Democrat controlled that whole period. You only win the House for 2 years, 1946 and 48. Before the 1930s, a majority of black or African American voters voted Republican. You lose the black vote to the Democrats. 71% of black voters voted for FDR in 1936. That is a flip from the 1920s. As late as the 1920s, black voters are voting Republican largely, majority. 71% of the New Deal, 71% of black voters vote for FDR. In 1960, 68% of black voters are voting for Kennedy. And so the Republican coalition has fallen apart. You're not winning elections anymore. Okay. By the 1960s, the Republican Party is an echo of the prevailing cultural and political liberalism of the era. Okay. In fact, one arrogant commentator said in the 1950s, liberalism is the only political affirmation in America. Okay. So it's a pretty arrogant point of view, and progressivism does tend to be pretty arrogant. So you kind of see an arrogant, liberalism is the only political affirmation in America. But we can understand that, right? You lose 5 straight elections. Congress is Democrat-controlled for decades and decades. So by the 1960s, the Republican Party is pretty weak. It's an echo of the prevailing cultural and political liberalism of the era. Okay, so in other words, it doesn't really matter who you vote for. You're going to get liberalism. You're either going to get Democrat liberalism or Republican liberalism, which would just be slower liberalism. Right? And so that's why the famous book, Barry Goldwater, a U.S. Senator, wrote a book in the 1960s called A Choice, Not an Echo. In other words, Barry Goldwater, when he ran for president in 1964, that's what he was telling voters, is I am a choice, not an echo. You get it? Americans, for the first time in decades, are getting an actual choice for president. Okay? An actual choice for president, not an echo of each other. Okay? And so that's the crisis of American conservatism. The Republican Party in the 1960s is weak. It's just Democrat light. It's just there's no reason to vote Republican. It's just liberalism. It's just slower liberalism than the prevailing liberal culture, liberal progressive culture. It's just and so a lot of conservative voters of the time period don't vote. Conservative, religious, evangelical Christians in the South, the Appalachians don't vote. The white working class, a lot of them don't vote. There's no reason to. Why? You're not. All you're going to get is liberalism. So the famous saying during the era was, if Americans are even later on, if Americans are given the choice between voting between a Democrat and a Democrat, they're going to vote for the Democrat. You get it? Americans need a choice. Okay? And so the crisis for American conservatism is this idea of the Republican Party in the 60s not really giving voters a choice. They're just an echo of the prevailing liberalism of the culture. Okay? Which led that commentator to say, that's why that commentator said, liberalism is the only political affirmation in America. Because he's like, Republicans just do what Democrats want, just slower. Okay. If I can make a comment about current day without getting people upset, the current day issue with American conservatism and the Republican Party is kind of the same thing. do conservative Americans, do Republican Americans want a choice in who they pick for president, or do they just want an echo of the prevailing progressive culture? One of the reasons President Trump speaks to Republican voters is what Barry Goldwater said: a choice, not an echo. Okay, so if I can kind of make a comparison without upsetting people and getting people offended by current day politics, one of the reasons President Trump is popular with Republicans, some Republicans and conservative voters, or even politically disaffected voters, the white working class, is he represents a choice, not an echo. And so that's why it's important to study the 60s. You can see threads of it even today, in 2024. This idea of, is the Republican Party, is American conservatism simply going to be what Democrats want, just a little slower? Okay? Or as Glenn Beck, a commentator, said, do you want socialism on a bullet train, the Democrats, or socialism walking there, Republicans? Okay? You get it? If the end goal is just Marxism, if the Republican and Democrat Party both say that, just Marxism, just slower, then that's not really a choice. You get it? And so, if I can make a comment up front, one of the appeals of President Trump is that he's a choice, not an echo. He offers a different vision than just the prevailing progressive culture, and so that's why voters are attracted to him, because of that. It's a choice, not an echo. You know what I mean? One reason why a lot of Republicans don't like President Trump is that reason is there's a lot of Republicans that are just an echo of the Democrats. We're gonna get progressivism just slower. Well, why vote for you then? If the end result is whatever Democrats want, well, I'll just vote Democrat or I won't vote. You get it? If the end result of the policies is whatever Democrats want or whatever progressives want, then there's no reason to vote Republican. There's no reason to vote at all. You get it? One of President Trump's things is he brings out people that don't vote. Because why? He offers a choice, not an echo. Okay. And so that's kind of the appeal. And why I bring that up is that you can see that in the 1960s. That choice, not an echo. Okay. And just so you know, I'm not saying you have to have a preferred candidate. So don't get offended me talking about it. I'm just explaining it. So I don't want students to get offended. I'm not saying you have to have a preferred candidate. I'm just explaining the point of view. Okay, so I'm not attacking any candidate. I'm just saying that it's a choice, not an echo kind of thing. So American conservatism in the 1960s is kind of at a low point. Okay. Next, you have the crisis of American liberalism. Okay. This is the new left. The crisis of American liberalism is the 1960s is this. So, what has happened in American politics since the 1930s? You have a consensus of American liberalism or progressivism. The progressive era, right? The progressive era, we talked about it. Believing in using the power of government to reform society, right? Okay. The crisis of American liberalism is this. The prevailing liberal order of the 1930s to the 60s is under attack during the 60s by its own adherents, by what's called the New Left. Okay? It's a generational thing. Okay? You have the generation that grew up during the Great Depression. You have the baby boom generation, right? That live in this consensus American liberalism, right? Liberalism is the only political affirmation in America. Okay, so think of it generationally. You have the grandparents. You have the grandparents, okay, that lived. The grandparents and the parents that remember the Great Depression, that fought World War II, okay, the American liberalism, using power of government to reform society, right? Roosevelt, a progressive, wins 4 elections in a row. Truman, a progressive too, a more conservative progressive, but progressive as well, right? So progressivism, you could argue progressivism as an ideology wins 5 straight elections. 20 years. You get it? So by the 1960s, you have an established liberal order, an established progressive order. Well, here's the problem. For the new left, it's a younger generation of people. Baby boomers, right? They're younger. They're more radical. Now we have to define that, right? They're more radical in that they critique that liberal order of anti-communism, of the slow pace of civil rights, of why are women restricted, why can't gays be open about being gay, why do women have to wear a bra, why do I have to be married before I have sex, why can't I take drugs, why can't I do this, why can't I do that? You start critiquing the older generation. In a lot of ways, the new left is a generational thing. You have the young baby boom generation critiquing their parents and their grandparents, who remember the Great Depression, who remember FDR, who remember World War II, right? This new left rejects the slow pace of reform. It also rejects the military-industrial complex. It rejects the military-industrial complex that fights the Cold War. Okay, it rejects the previous generation, right? It takes over rock and roll. Here's your example. Go look at my YouTube playlist on rock and roll. Go listen to rock music in the 1950s. And then go listen to rock music in the 1960s, the late 1960s. They're very different. What has changed? This crisis of American liberalism, okay? The new left, the younger generation of liberals and progressives, attack the older generation. Okay, you're attacking norms in society. You're deconstructing, famous Marxist word. You're deconstructing society. Why are we going so slow on reforming society? Why do I have to be square and have these old morals of sex before marriage? I mean, marriage before sex. Marriage before sex. Why do I have to go die in the jungles of Vietnam? To fight communism? What? You have this critique of fighting the Cold War, of liberal internationalism. Why, like Stalin, communists aren't bad. Communism is the way to go. So you have a very Marxist, very statist, very militant, in this case violent. Go look up Weather Underground. Go Google Weather Underground. Okay. Race rioting in the 60s. Go Google all the race rioting in the 60s. A much more militant, in some cases violent reform of society. It appears American liberalism in the 1960s appears under attack from within. Its own younger generation looks at the parents and goes, You guys are square. You're wrong. You're not helping progress. You're holding us back. You're not progressing society. You're holding us back, man. Fight the establishment, man. Okay? The establishment, that liberal establishment, is an obstacle to progress. Okay? This new left is much more militant, much more willing to have violence, much more willing to deconstruct society. Okay? In some ways, it's the birth of the current activist or woke cancel culture that we live in today. This is why you want to study it. Echoes of the 60s still live with us today. Why? Because today, all those young baby boomers in the 60s that were part of the new left, guess what they are today? They're college professors. They're in government jobs. They're college professors. They're the Bernie Sanders of the world. Okay? Then that's one of the reasons why a lot of your education is Marxist in nature. Because it's kind of been taken over by the people that teach you are in general politically progressive or communist or some form of Marxism. You're taught that, right? And so it's kind of we see the birth of this current kind of activist or woke cancel culture. And you see it today. You young people today, think about what you get mad at about the older generation, right? Kind of the same thing. Black Lives Matter, defund the police, pro-Palestinian, free Gaza stuff, environmental protests, right? It's kind of, in some ways, it's kind of that same thread. Society isn't progressing fast enough. Okay? And so you want to push it, kind of a thing. Okay. So the crisis of American liberalism. Another aspect of American culture that I want to talk about is this idea of suicide of the West. When you study the 1960s, why it's pivotal, you need to study this decade because we see the effects of it today. And again, when you study even the political culture of today, it's important. You see the 60s, you see the effects of it today. One of the examples is called suicide of the West. It's a term coined in 1964. A guy named James Burnham wrote a book called Suicide of the West. That's the name of the book, Suicide of the West. Okay. James Burnham's thesis was that Western civilization, Europe, North and South America, European, any country or culture that derives from the ancient Greeks and Romans, or is Judeo-Christian. Okay. Western civilization is committing suicide as it rejects traditional institutions in Judeo-Christian religion that built it and sustained it through 2,000 years. Okay. This is what the new left is fighting. Okay. The new left that develops in the 1960s, they are creating the environment to critique the American West in this way. Okay. You and I, so far we've already seen hints of this. We've talked about it. We talked about it. in the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, what did one writer say? Everything that will be invented has been invented. How progressive are we? How progressive are we, Western civilization? Europe, North South America? How progressive are we? Judeo-Christian culture, Christian culture, Judeo-Christian ethics. We're so good, we've reached the summit, right? We're the best. Nobody beats us, right? We're the dominant culture in the world. All those European empires, right? America, reaching out, right? Or expanding its influence. But what happened? you had World War One, right? World War One destroyed that confidence. So you and I have already begun tracing this idea of suicide of the West. You start with World War One. You start losing your moral authority, right? You lose your moral authority. You lose your moral confidence. Okay. And then what did we see after World War II? What happens to those European empires? The British, the French, the Germans, the Belgians. What happened to their empires? They fall apart, right? You've lost Western civilization. You've lost this moral authority to run the world, kind of a thing, right? So in the 1950s and 60s, you have decolonization as Europe gets rid of its empires. Okay, that's part of the suicide of the West. This where the Western civilization, the countries and cultures that are Christian, that derive from Roman and Greek philosophy, so it'd basically be Europe and North and South America, Australia, European Australia, any culture that came out of ancient Greece and ancient Rome and Judeo-Christianity, right? Christianity specifically. You've lost the moral authority. You've lost this progressive confidence, right? And part of the rise of the new left is furthering the deconstruction, that's that word again, the deconstruction of Western civilization. Okay? And you see that today. Okay? When you study you and I, the younger generation, you see that today. Some modern day examples of writers that talk about the suicide of the West. And I see I made a mistake there. Jonah Goldberg and Patrick Buchanan. Pat Buchanan wrote a book called Suicide of the West. Okay, it is it's kind of a modern retelling of that thesis that James Burnham did. So Patrick Buchanan had a book called Suicide of the West, where he talked about the decline of Western civilization. That's committing suicide. Western civilization is intentionally killing itself. Okay. Because it rejects the traditional morals and institutions. It has convicted itself. Because what Western civilization, you have World War I and World War II. You have all these bad things, right? And so you have the suicide, this deconstructing of American culture and Western culture. Some current day examples for you guys that you see that today, that are examples of the suicide of the West, or this deconstructing Western civilization. You could say started with the end of World War I, right? The loss of moral confidence and continues to our day. For example, 21st century, popularizing Eastern religions, rejection of Judeo-Christian morals and ethics, the kind of an anti-Christian vibe. Okay, watch popular TV shows today. Christians are mocked. They're viewed as evil. They're viewed as villains. They're portrayed as terrorists sometimes. Okay, multiculturalism, cultural Marxism. Schools and universities no longer teaching people like Shakespeare or Western Civ classes. In other words, Shakespeare is... We're not going to talk about Shakespeare. We're not going to talk about the dead white guys. Right? Cancel culture. Okay? Woke, so you've heard the term woke or social justice warrior. Cultural appropriation, whiteness studies. Tearing down statues, renaming institutions, rewriting of history. Okay? Rewriting history. Before, in the early 20th century, history was generally written from a Western civilization, European point of view. Europe triumphant. History today is the exact opposite, where you're attacking the West. You're attacking the Constitution. America's not a good country. America's a bad country. Today we're taught to disrespect our founders. We're taught to hate. You're literally taught in school sometimes to hate America. Okay, And then we wonder why American society's coming apart, right? You get it? Today in your school, you're literally taught to hate your country. You're taught to hate America. And then we turn around and wonder why our society seems to be coming apart. Well, you have a generation of people being taught to hate their country. Why fight for your country? Why love your country? Why keep your country together if you hate it? I mean, you know, and so you kind of act surprised about this, but you know, you're taught to hate your country rather than love it. Acceptance of ideologies like Marxism, identity politics, an anti-white vibe, whiteness, stereotyping all white people as naturally racist and in need of re-education. DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion programs. Acceptance of double standards and rules for different groups. Censorship on the internet. Conservative points of view are censored. Lack of freedom of speech on college campuses. Okay. So, you know, you see all kinds of examples of that, you know. So those are, you know, and so, you know, you history students, you go, why do I have to study this stuff? Because you are living history. You're in it, right? The trend in American history today is from the 60s on, this deconstructing of Western civilization, this deconstructing of America and Americanism, right? And so that's why it's an important topic for you to talk about, and that's why I'm bringing it up with you. Okay, it's something for you to consider. Okay. This video's gone on kind of a little too long, but I'll go ahead and finish really quick. The election 1964, Barry Goldwater, Republican Senator. Barry Goldwater is the most ideologically conservative presidential candidate since Calvin Coolidge. Republicans haven't nominated a conservative candidate like this since Coolidge. Okay. I won't bore you by going over all the candidates, but it's a long video now. But maybe in class, like if you ask in class if you want, and I'll go over it. But you don't have conservative candidates anymore. Another book that Goldwater wrote was Conscience of a Conservative. So he wrote two books: A Choice, Not an Echo, and Conscience of a Conservative. Okay. Voters deserve a clear choice politically and ideologically. That's why Barry Goldwater ran. You know, the race shouldn't be between Democrat and Democrat light. It should be between Democrat and kind of a Democrat. It should be between a Democrat and a Republican. Okay. Goldwater's going to lose in a landslide. Go look at the 1964 election results. Political commentators in the 60s thought that was going to be the end of the Republican Party. There was going to be no more Republican Party. The Republican Party would never win an election again. Ever. Ever. Conservatism's dead, people argued at the time. Again, for some, it was proof that liberalism is the only political affirmation in America. It's the nadir, or the bottom, of American conservatism. Okay? And the rest of the semester will follow that back, right? What happened in 1980? You had Ronald Reagan win, right? And so that's the end of that. So that is the election 1960, or that is the 1960s. Thank you for your patience in watching the video.